This week was Flag Day, June 14th. Flag makers across the country are reportedly, this is according to left-wing outlets, are reportedly on standby because the Democrats in Congress are proposing to make Washington, D.C. a state. And if that were to happen, the American flag would need to be readjusted. Well, here's why making D.C. the 51st state is a terrible, unconstitutional idea. And they're actually two different things. It's both a terrible idea and it's an unconstitutional idea, the way the Democrats are doing it. We're also going to talk about why the Democrats, taxation without representation, that's what they're claiming is the reason why they want to make D.C. a state, why that argument from the Democrats is baloney. First of all, why are the Democrats pushing for D.C. statehood? That's where we should start. Why are they trying to make D.C. the 51st state? Are they really worried about lack of representation? Well, no. The answer to that is obviously no. Otherwise, the Democrats would oppose the administrative state in our federal government, which is government bureaucrats in charge of rulemaking. These are agencies of the federal government. They make rules, essentially dictating policy, yet the bureaucrats in the administrative state are unaccountable to voters. We talked about this 2 weeks ago on the show, how the administrative state came from Woodrow Wilson through LBJ, through FDR, and now it's the swamp creatures. We're talking Fauci's. Okay, but a lot of different Fauci's. So if the Democrats were worried about a lack of representation, then they would oppose the administrative state, but they don't. So then we have to say, okay, well, if they truly wanted representation, they would also give most of the Washington, D.C. area back to the state of Maryland. They would keep only the federal structures as the seat of the federal government. And then if they gave back that land to Maryland, then all those people that live there would be able to vote in Maryland. They would have Maryland to represent them. The representatives of Maryland would be their representatives. But the Democrats aren't against the administrative state, and they don't want to give back the area in D.C., surrounding D.C., to Maryland. So that speaks of an ulterior motive. Shocker, the Democrats with an ulterior motive. So their ulterior motive is obvious. They want 2 additional Democrat senators in the United States Senate, and this would be a given. It really would if Washington, D.C. were to become a state, because the voter registration in Washington, D.C. is 76.4% Democrat and just 5.7% GOP. So there would never be a chance of a Republican senator. So when the Democrats claim that they have this larger purpose, this larger reason that they want, this philosophical reason almost, that they want D.C. to be a state, they're lying. They just want 2 senators. So it's a bad idea from a policy perspective for Republicans. It's also unconstitutional to do this the way that the Democrats are trying to do this. So they want to just pass some piece of legislation in the House and then in the Senate, and then have the president sign it into law to make D.C. a state. But you can't do that. That's unconstitutional. According to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, it gives Congress plenary local lawmaking power to, and I quote here, this is the Constitution, to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district. Okay, Clause 17 is what we're talking about. So it obviously starts, Congress shall have power, and then to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district, this is key, not exceeding 10 miles square, as may, by session of particular states and the acceptance of Congress, become the seat of government of the United States. So what does this tell us? It tells us that, well, first, it would be unconstitutional for the Congress to simply declare that the seat of the federal government was a state, because the Constitution specifically says the seat of the government of the United States is not a state. Just read it to you. So you can't just do this legislatively. Also in 1961, if you're looking at this historically, the 23rd Amendment passed, right? The 23rd Amendment gave the residents of Washington, D.C. the right to vote in presidential elections as if D.C. were a state. But that required, again, that's the 23rd Amendment. That means the Constitution was amended to give D.C. residents the right to vote in presidential elections. So how could you need a constitutional amendment to vote, but not to become a state? Of course, this requires a constitutional amendment, not just congressional legislation. This is inarguable. Anybody who's saying that it just requires legislation is acting in bad faith. They're engaging just in political rhetoric and assuming that you're ignorant and won't do your research. Because a constitutional amendment is unlikely in this case, it would require 2/3 votes of both House and Senate and ratification by 38 states. That's not going to happen, right? It's not going to happen. It would require not just a simple majority and a presidential signature. And by the way, this is not just my opinion as a conservative. The Department of Justice, under both Republican and Democrat administrations, have found that D.C. statehood requires a constitutional amendment. So it's not constitutional to do it the way the Democrats are doing it. They have an ulterior motive. It's also not what the founders intended for the seat of the federal government, and for good reasons. The founders intended to deny the federal capital statehood, and we should ask ourselves why, because we probably aren't taught this in school. Well, James Madison, in Federalist Paper number 43, specifically said the federal capital needs to be distinct from the states, and the reason for this is to provide its own safety and maintenance. This is what he said. He said the public authority might be insulted and its proceedings interrupted with impunity if the seat of the federal government were in a state. So in other words, the seat of the federal government was intended not to be a state so that Congress and the president, too, did not have to answer to or rely on the governor of a state. Think about that for a second. Think about the corruption that could happen if Congress and the president were reliant on a governor or a state legislature, even of the state in which the seat of the federal government resided. So Madison goes on in Federalist Paper number 43. He said, the gradual accumulation of public improvements at the stationary residence of the government would be both too great a public pledge to be left in the hands of a single state and would create so many obstacles to a removal of the government as still further to abridge its necessary independence. What he means by that, in other words, the founders didn't want the federal government to be beholden to a state or influenced unduly by a state's implicit or explicit threats of coercion. So basically, they didn't want the state to blackmail the federal government into passing a law or signing something, if you're the president, that would benefit that state more than others, maybe even at the detriment of other states, the detriment of the union. So it's unconstitutional, it's unwise, the founders didn't want it, and the ulterior motive of the left is very clear here. There's actually another reason too. So Washington, D.C. area has roughly 700,000 residents. And it's supposed to, or it was intended to house government workers only temporarily. Our founders didn't create our country to have this permanent class of government bureaucrats or even permanent class career politicians. No, it was never intended to be the home of a gargantuan administrative state. The founders never envisioned so many people living and working in D.C. And yes, all the more reason to restrict the power of the bloated federal government. Why would we give them more power? If Washington, D.C. was a state and it housed this permanent administrative class, the state then would be incentivized to grow the federal government to accumulate even more power. So it's unconstitutional to try to do it legislatively. It's unwise. The Democrats have an ulterior motive, and it's not what the founders envisioned. Hi, before you go, let me talk to you about something. As you know, I've been censored on Facebook and YouTube, so I partnered with locals to create a censorship-free community. I also just launched my show, and I have a lot of exciting new things coming up that I want to make sure I can share with you and get your input on. I'm going to be sharing behind-the-scenes looks of my set and my show prep, and I get a lot of questions about my hair and makeup routines, my research process, and so much more. So I'll give you sneak peeks of all of that. I'll also be doing exclusive segments of my show just for Locals VIPs. All of my interviews will be shared on Locals for VIPs to watch as well. I'll be taking questions directly from VIPs for the video mailbag in my show, and you'll get the episodes free from ads. Who doesn't love that? Not to mention, I'll keep doing everything that you've already come to love. Ask me questions for live Q&As. Let's talk about your favorite books, what yummy vegan food I'm eating for lunch, and what ridiculous headlines I'm reading today. You can do all of that and more, but only if you are a Liz Wheeler Show VIP on Locals. The monthly subscription is $9 a month, but if you really want a good deal, we have an annual subscription for just $72. That's 4 months free. 4 months. So join me on Locals as a VIP. I'll see you over there.